Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Downtown Seattle Association. Thank you, Chuck, for that warm introduction. Thank you, John, Richard, Mayor. Thank you for having me. And I've had such an incredibly and literally warm welcome here in February in Seattle. So it's a pleasure to be here. I also would be remiss if I didn't, as an immigrant, thank the Ninth Circuit Court and your Attorney General. So thank you. These are kind of confusing, troubling times we live in, so I thought I would start the morning with a piece of good news, which is actually, this came out a couple of weeks ago. The world is getting less poor. And I know this actually from some of the charity work that my family does in India and also from colleagues at Columbia. We have a tremendous number of people, actually billions of people over the last couple of decades, moving from poverty into the middle class around the world. And this is obviously very good news. But with it comes consequences. And it's interesting, you saw in the introduction, there were a number of statistics about worldwide urbanization, but I'm going to actually offer a slightly different view, which is that the world isn't urbanizing, the world is suburbanizing. That as billions of people move into the middle class, what you see as you sort of go around the world is an extraordinary amount of sprawl. So I wrote this book, as Chuck mentioned, and the reason I did it is because I feel that when you talk about global growth or growth here in Seattle or New York, that this country still is kind of, people look to our lifestyle as a kind of, as a leadership model. And as we look to our lifestyle, I think we, in turn, change the world. And so I'm going to argue for a certain kind of density, but not density for density's sake. I'm not talking about just building skyscrapers anywhere willy-nilly, but what I call a kind of eco-density, density based on a very rich mass transit system of walkability, of bikeability, and a very mixed economy. And I want to emphasize that when I talk about this, I'm not just speaking about every place having to become Manhattan or London. And sorry this picture is blurry, I took it coming off on an airplane in Tokyo. This is a typical Japanese farming village. It actually reminds me of the farming village that my dad was born in India. And what you'll notice about it that's different is that the farmers live in clusters. And they go out and they farm the fields, but they don't live in their individual farmhouses. And it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we build a society. You think about how much cheaper the infrastructure is when you build things that way, and how much more of a sense of community those farmers have by living in a more dense circumstance. So I think the lesson applies at any scale. In the book, I talk about eco-density, and I know many of you are development professionals, of about 30 dwelling units per acre, and that's enough to support light rail or some form of mass transit. And that's really row house density. We're not talking, again, about skyscrapers necessarily. And what's interesting is at that density, all 7 billion people in the world could live in Texas. Now, I'm not suggesting we all move. But what I am suggesting is that maybe as the world does change and grow, that we need to think about using a lot less land and living in more compact circumstances. Americans today, about 12% of us live at 30 units per acre. Most of us live in much less density. And one of the questions I want to ask is, I don't want to in any way be derogatory towards how anyone lives or what choices they've made in their personal lives. But I think what is interesting as a policy issue is, have we put the finger on the scale in terms of how the market reacts, how people make individual decisions about how they live? And I'm going to argue that we have, starting with the biggest infrastructure that this country ever built, the Federal Highway Act in 1956, that obviously diffused the population. The fact that since the passage of the Highway Act, we've seen a precipitous decline in infrastructure investment around the country. The fact that we heavily subsidize roads over any other form of transportation in the country, that we heavily subsidize the oil and gas industry over renewables, that we tend to think, well, there's not enough money to build affordable housing in our country, and yet the largest federal expenditure on housing is the mortgage interest deduction that goes to people who have houses that are up to $1 million in value. And so are we spending our precious resources the right way? Because what we're doing is, when you take all of those policies and you combine them with the fact that a lot of planners around the country have been actively downzoning our cities for the past 3 decades or so, what you come to understand is we lost a tremendous amount of density throughout most of the United States in the 20th century. And that was not an accident, it was not free market choices, it was by design. And that left us with an environment that really is incredibly segregated and isolated. And when I think about this last election, regardless of your political persuasion, there's a lot of talk about the bubbles we live in, how segregated we've become. And I put this squarely on the automobile, which is its own form of metal bubble, that actually separates us in terms of how we think and how we live. And so I think I'm preaching to the converted from the sense I've got in the 24 hours that I've been here, that the notion that having a more compact, more dense way of living that's largely rail-based is a better way to go as a city like this grows. And that I want to caution people against this idea. We're Americans, right? So we like to buy more stuff when there's a problem, right? So buying more cars and windmills and all of that to kind of retrofit a 20th century technology is maybe not the answer to where we need to head. But I also don't want it to all feel like this is about eating your spinach. There's a lot of statistics around the fact that being able to take mass transit, being able to walk to work, generates joy, a sense of civic delight, that road rage, drinking and driving, texting while driving is very different than being able to take, read a book on a piece of light rail and then see your friends and have more time with your family. So there are a lot of social benefits we can talk about. This is from a Swedish study that shows that absence does make the heart grow fonder, that divorce rates increase with commute times. I always get that wrong. The American Medical Association has told us that obesity, and especially childhood obesity, increases with sprawl. But we also have to think about, and I know you're thinking about, the fact that walkable environments are proving to be more unaffordable, that they are more expensive. And so one of the things we have to do is double down on affordability and mixed income in our cities. Not just through government programs, but just to think about the fact that basically affordable housing is, your housing shouldn't cost more than a third of your income. And by that metric, since World War II, we've lost a massive amount of affordable housing all over the country. And it's interesting, what I worry about as I see these trends is Paris. We all love Paris. When we go to Paris, we see about 15% of Paris when we go there. And it's rich, and it's wonderful, and it's very pleasant. But the fact is the suburbs have become poorer, there's a lot of social unrest, and there's a lot of people worried about this in this country as our cities are prospering more than our suburban regions. And so I think what this calls for in the 21st century is a reevaluation of the American dream itself. If you go back to the 30s and the actual stating of the American dream, it was never quite about owning your own home or owning your own car. It wasn't about this notion that over time, that our children would become less prosperous than we were, which is precisely what happened over the course of this last recession. But the opposite, that we would come from wherever we came from, we would work hard, our kids would get educated, and they would actually live a more prosperous life. So in other words, that the American dream wasn't about a piece of land. It was about the fundamental idea of opportunity for every man, woman, and child. And I'm going to argue that those opportunities really do rest with our cities, that cities are the solution, as Richard said in the beginning of the morning, because 3% of our land mass generates most of our jobs, most of our income, and most of our GDP, which is not to knock agriculture. Agriculture is incredibly important, but we have to understand where the economy is in this new world. And one of the things that's interesting, and I know this is true about Seattle, it's certainly true about most of the cities that I visit around the country. Cities used to be one-trick ponies. They were built, New York was built around the financial industry, Washington around the political industry. Washington and New York have an extraordinary number of technology jobs today, just as Seattle does. And so what creates the economic base of our cities is changing, and we need to take advantage of that. And so if we think about, if you look at this as a sort of an MRI, right, that if this is the country today, we could have a much greener country in the future, one built around an urban environment. And in the book, I won't go through this in detail, I talk about this thing that I call the whole enchilada, about how we could take the subsidy system that we generated after World War II that fueled suburbanization and reorient it in something I call the American Smart Infrastructure Act, or ASIA for short, hint, hint. Because we are going to lose. when you see these kinds of discrepancies in what we invest in our infrastructure versus what other countries are investing in their infrastructure, we know we have a problem. So, for instance, about 70% of our population lives in 7 or 8 megaregions around the country. This is one of them. Those megaregions should be connected by high-speed rail. We shouldn't have all this sort of regional air travel that we have. It would save a massive amount of time. It would employ an awful lot of people. And it would be a great investment in our future with interest rates still seemingly low. And so the argument for infrastructure is one not just of traditional infrastructure, but what I like to call an infrastructure of opportunity, investing more in culture, in parks, in affordable housing, in things that create social mobility in our society. And the argument is that that investment will be truly an investment. And the reason for that is that our economy will grow. We have a lot of data that shows that as people live in denser circumstances, more innovation happens, more patent creation happens, and it's because people are running around and running into each other, and there's serendipity, and as a consequence, there's innovation. And so I think one of the things we're witnessing now is the death of the office park. We're seeing that model in serious trouble, this notion that technology was going to allow us to work on a mountaintop away from a city somewhere. And what we're seeing instead is this idea, this is a kind of diagram of some of the things that I learned on a recent trip to Barcelona, where they've created a very high-tech city built around the idea that people should walk. Not just because it's good for you, but because walking creates, in their minds, contemplation and the ability to innovate. And they call this human speed, that the technology works for us, not the other way around. And I think this is just a wonderful concept, and it's part of what I've learned and grown with my own work. Chuck mentioned the work on the High Line, which is an extraordinary sort of new node in our city that works at human speed, all this great architecture around it, the extension of our number 7 line, which is an extension of our subway line for Hudson Yards. And what I'm arguing then is what our cities can become is not just a world of skyscrapers, but a kind of network of villages that sit within our cities. And so I'm going to try to explain that in a bit. And also explain that I think architecture, as an architect, plays really a critical role, because if you look at the 3 challenges of our time, of climate change, of inequity, social inequity, and technological processing power, all of that's playing out in the platform of the city. And so this is my office. This is the kind of stuff we try to work on, this idea of the more multinodal city, not just one central business district, but a whole slew of central districts. Because the fact is, through the 50s, we built cities for this guy. And he thrived on segregation and isolation, as we know. But the fact is, this is not today's worker. This is. And what that worker wants is fundamentally different. She wants to be in a different environment. She wants to be in a much more shared environment. And that idea of the central business district doesn't work the same way. So just a couple of examples from my own work in the minutes that I have left. Out in Brooklyn, we're seeing a lot of this change take place. And I'm sorry these are a lot of New York examples, but I'm hoping in the Q&A we can talk about Seattle relative to some of these New York examples. But this is an office building with a vocational school at the bottom. It's about 400,000 square feet. What's interesting is there isn't a big anchor tenant. It's about incubating small companies like my own, but also having that vocational school connect in different ways to the building above. The building will be hand-laid brick, and this is where I think architecture really matters. If you're going to argue density to people, you have to convince them that it belongs in their neighborhood, that it couldn't just go anywhere. And this is an old industrial neighborhood. And so I think of this building as kind of the warehouse of the future, if you will. And so that's something that really interests me, this idea of the warehouse of the future and how work could be different. I know you have very strong broadband connectivity here. Also in Newark, New Jersey, we have a similar situation where, I won't go through this in detail, but this is a mixed-use, mixed-income project, which is what I've kind of dedicated our work to, and a kind of rejuvenation of Newark with lots of housing. But you notice the scale. And the scale is very important. This isn't even architecture yet. These collages are meant to connote texture, courtyards, the kinds of things that build community. In Mexico City, a project where we're trying to build on a lot of existing assets, a beautiful chapel that's at the end of this site, but also, and I think this is an interesting challenge for the developers out there, I think in this new world, we should start breaking down some of our efficiency standards for things like double-loaded corridors and segregated uses, because again, they tend to create a sense of isolation. So we're looking at different shared spaces off of single-loaded corridors, which I know might give a heart attack or two to a developer out there, but I think it's an important thing to study, and how you create community inside of a building that's different than just that isolated double-loaded corridor. And also the notion, by the way, one of the reasons I brought this project is of having a lot of density without so much height. This is not one of the taller projects in Mexico City, and I call it kind of a ground scraper. And I think there are different ways of achieving density without all of that height. And then there's height. So in New York, a project where it's a mix of a hotel and an office. But one of the things that was interesting with this was to bring the hotel down to the base of the building, even though its floor plates are typically smaller, because it gave us the opportunity to create an atrium that was connected to the subway system down below. So in all of our projects, we try to incorporate something public into the work, something attached to transit. So that's that transit atrium. And that's a kind of view of that atrium looking and spilling up into the hotel atrium above. That's about 500 keys. And so you see the connection from the street all the way up to that atrium. So, you know, again, you think about the old hotel atriums and the way they were segregated from the city, trying to create connection. So this is from that hotel atrium looking down onto the street. And then we do some research projects. I think this would be interesting. One of the things, and I know you're looking and have some tensions with, there's a manufacturing area. How could you have development there? I believe in this new world we can mix buildings that are manufacturing with residential. Probably not heavy manufacturing, but a lot of light manufacturing. And so we've done some research around, you know, what would it take to actually be able to say, well, a technology company could live next to a light manufacturer, and in that same building there could be a family of 4, and a dentist's office, and a jewelry maker. And the answer for the developers out there is there's a lot more CapEx and infrastructure. But what's nice is you have a lot more protection or hedging against market risk, because you can rent the building to anyone. And this is also a question and a challenge to building codes, because building codes don't allow this from the 20th century, actually, and I think we need to relook at that. New transit systems and infrastructure. I know Portland has one of these. New York is looking at them as well, as a way of sort of bringing people in mass transit through the sky. Also on the ground, I know you've got a lot of discussions about light rail and so forth here. We have all sorts of conversations going on about both bus rapid transit, and this is a competition to actually have bus rapid transit stations later turn into streetcar systems, because again, even in New York with our very rich subway system, we have transit deserts and we have new places that are growing and need a different kind of transit. And so with all of this work, we try to get very architectural. And then lastly, and this is a lesson about really focusing on what you have. The New York Times asked us to look at Penn Station. For those of you who know Penn Station, it's a place you don't want to spend a lot of time. There's a 20,000-seat, very old arena called Madison Square Garden that sits right on top of the busiest transit hub in the Western Hemisphere. There aren't a lot of good solutions, so the Times actually called us up and asked us to look at this, and we had this crazy idea. The Garden actually is interested in moving, and so we said the problem has always been, how do you afford to build a new station once the Garden moves with all those people down there? And we said, hey, what if we didn't tear down the Garden, but actually recycled its structure and used it as a train station? So these images I'm showing you is actually literally that, of recycling its structure, its foundations, its roof, putting a new glass curtain wall on it, passively heating and cooling it, and then making that the center of a new neighborhood that would incredibly increase in value, and doing some kind of tax increment financing to pay for it. And it's actually not that expensive because of the amount of recycling going on. So you see a new Garden, new Amtrak station, new commuter station. And these are just some before and afters of what that would look like. So that would be the largest civic enclosed space in New York City, and that's literally the inside of the Garden with the Garden removed. And so I'm just going to close by saying, so you know, the stuff that I'm interested in is that stuff that's up there, and I think it is the way in which cities can be solutions for things. But what I really want to emphasize is, I think work is successful when work is specific, when it's about your place, when it's about really looking at what makes a new building part of Seattle. Why should it be here? Does it have the infrastructure to support it? And if so, let's applaud that density. So thank you very much for your attention this morning. I'm happy to answer a few questions.